Some of the wisest words on the topic of political leadership come from Theodore Roosevelt in a speech he gave in 1910. And I'm just going to paraphrase it. In the long run of history, the credit belongs to those who are in the arena and who, if they fail, at least fail while daring greatly, so that their place will never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. It makes politics seem like a noble sport, to serve, to try, and if you fail, at least, well, you stood up and you gave it your best shot. These days, it seems the view of politics is a little different. Either people know nothing about how Parliament works or how the system works, but still have a view, or they believe it's all some house of cards conspiracy inhabited by rabid partisans or those simply in search of an easy job and a paycheck. So we're going to delve down a little bit into what really goes on behind the scenes in politics, in political parties, and in our parliament. We have two political scientists with us today. They are serious political geeks. I've got to say that this is research that you can't believe. Let me introduce Jean-François Godbout. He is with the University of Montreal. He's a professor of political science. He has written a book entitled Lost on Division: Party Unity in the Canadian Parliament. And it is the development of party discipline in Canada by analyzing all the votes recorded in the House and the Senate, get this, between 1867 and 2015. That is an academic exercise. We also have with us today Alex Marland. His book is entitled Whipped: Party Discipline in Canada, and that is a phrase. There is a person called the whip, and they are the person who is responsible for making sure that MPs, and in some cases senators, stay in line, say what they're supposed to say, and vote the way they're supposed to vote. He is a professor of political science at Memorial. He's a Donner Prize winner from an earlier book, Canadian Politics and Democracy in the Age of Message Control, entitled Brand Command. So we're going to get into those issues. Let me start with Jean-François. Thank you so much. So just to be clear, you've analyzed every vote. You stopped in 2015, so we don't have voting records since Justin Trudeau was elected. You stopped at that point.
That is correct. Thank you for the invitation. Yes, I've collected over the last 10 years with an army of research assistants and computer
I bet you had an army.
Yeah, well, some of it was automated, but we've collected all the what's called recorded divisions in Parliament, so recorded votes. So that's when your MP or your senator goes on record and says, I am in favor or I am opposed, vote yea or nay on a specific bill or motion. So we have these votes, about 10,000 over time in the House, for instance, a little less in the Senate.
Right.
But so we have records in the parliamentary debates of how, John A. Macdonald or Wilfrid Laurier, all the politicians, all the elected members, how they voted throughout their career. And so one of the enduring puzzle of Canadian politics, as Alex, he studies this as well, is why our party is so strong in Canada. Why is party discipline so ubiquitous, right? So every party basically now tolerates very little dissensions among it when we look at members' voting record.
So have you seen that change over time? Is that really what? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So in order to get a sense of how we got there, I sort of asked myself, well, how was it, at Confederation time, was it? I suspected it was much lower than in terms of like unity, in terms of cohesive the parties were. I suspected it was much lower, but I went out and dug into the data, and what I found is there was an increase, a substantive increase throughout the 19th century, all the way up to the 1920s, more or less, where party unity increased for the Conservative and the Liberal Party in the House at an important rate, up to a point where the levels you observe around 1920s are more or less comparable to what you observed towards the end of the 20th century. Now in the 21st century, and that's more Alex's sort of contribution,
right,
it's even higher now. It's there was room to grow, but now it's really extremely rare that you see a House member vote against the party. We saw that in their most recent vote over the throne speech. I think an MP
Right.
of the Bloc Québécois voted by accident. When I saw that, I was like, oh my God, I told my students in the class, yes, this must be an error. And they didn't believe me. They thought the Godbout doesn't know what he's talking about. But the next day they came out and said, yeah, there was an error in recording the vote. So it's really rare that you see, especially on government motion, you see the essential. So what I do is I explain what happened over time. Argument is quite long and complicated, but just to summarize it in one sentence, that's maybe 3 words: procedures, procedures, procedures. Government took over what the debates around 1900, what was being said, what was being introduced in terms of bills in motion in the House, and they kind of weakened the influence of private members over time, and that's where you saw most of the sort of the free spirit or free speech or whatever you want to call it, but actions of MPs that were not controlled by parties. So these opportunities decline over time because rules were changed, and that's the situation where we are in now, and it can be traced back to decisions that were made 100 years ago. That's why it's so interesting in the sense that
exactly
the dice were already, the game was
loaded,
already played in 1920. And that's the argument. So that's
even
it.
Free votes are not very free these days, and I think that really goes to the point. And the interesting title of your book, Alex, which is "Whipped," which it does really mean that the word of the whip, the person who's responsible for keeping everybody in line, and also I might say doling out some favors or some discipline, however that works, basically is there to say you vote with us or you're not one of us. How did that become so strong from your vantage point? You've done dozens of interviews with former prime ministers and ordinary members of parliament. What did you learn?
Before I can even answer that, I just have to say it is so amazing to be talking to Senator Pamela Wallin. Like, it is just a moment of amazingness in my life. So I think the real...
You need to get a life, Alex.
Well, obviously I've arrived. So the thing to keep in mind is when you talk with politicians and political staff, and you talk about why is party discipline so strong, sometimes I'm not sure that they themselves necessarily even know.
Right.
The more interviews that I did, the more I've talked with people, the more I've become convinced that there are incredible social and structural pressures on people to toe the party line. It begins right from the moment that you get involved with a political party, from the moment that you become a candidate and you're filling out these forms and they're doing this check into your background about whether or not you support party values. The moment you arrive on Parliament Hill, you start realizing that your ideas of potentially changing things are now going to have to involve working with a whole bunch of other people. And you want to move up the career ladder. And if you take a stand, you are going to cause problems for your colleagues. That was the number one thing that I find interesting, is just about how people have challenges with their colleagues.
You also, though, want to be in favor with the party leader, whether he's prime minister or opposition leader or whatever, because if you're not, those signals will be fairly strong up and down the food chain if you have stood in your place to criticize the party or his or her behavior. It is both. It's obviously your colleagues, but also leadership.
And more than that, it's the leader's staff. And this for me was something that I really realized has changed, is that the staff presence in caucus meetings has been increasing over time. There used to be a time where caucus was really an enclave. Staff weren't allowed to be there. And now, particularly under Justin Trudeau, there is a whole bunch of staff who is at a caucus meeting. And, backbenchers are aware that, these are people who can control their careers. So you better be careful about what you say in front of these people.
You wrote in your first book that really MPs, and I think it was, of course, Pierre Elliott Trudeau that said MPs are nobody once they're 10 feet from Parliament Hill. But you said they really have simply just become media brand ambassadors to represent the party line, quite literally.
Yeah, so this is part of what I believe in, and really what I've done builds very well on what Jean-François has done.
Right.
It's making this argument that originally MPs were lawmakers. That was a lot of what they did, and they still do. And then gradually, as government became larger, particularly around the 1940s and 1950s, they increasingly became constituency caseworkers. So they were helping Canadians try to navigate the difficulties of government. My argument is that another layer has been added, another role, and that role is as a brand ambassador. So in other words, this is not new. It's just more, it's broader than it used to be. So prime ministers have always wanted to have backbenchers carry the government's message. It's just that now that's a defined part of the job. You are given messages all day long, and staff are pumping them out for you. And of course, why this matters is because backbenchers become part of the government when really backbenchers are meant to hold the government to account.
But that's a really, really fundamental point, because as a backbencher, you are, and there used to be, the whip or other such people that you could go and talk to and say, look, where I live, I think the party's just not resonating. I think it's going off the rails. We have to understand that this matters to people in my riding and other ridings. And there was a way to communicate that and bring that message and stand up in a caucus room and deliver it. Much, much more difficult today.
Yeah, and I think one thing that a lot of people aren't aware of is that in some ways, MPs matter even less, because what's happening is they are being pressed to collect data on the doorsteps and to put in these electronic consoles, and the information is then going into a database that staff can then access. So if you're an MP and you stand up in caucus and you say, yeah, but this matters in my riding, staff and others can say, well, you may say it matters, but in fact, according to the data that we have, that's not actually the case.
Yeah.
And not only that, but they can also get cut off from the access to the data. You're no longer an MP with the party. All of your data about your constituents vanishes.
Well, and the party does that, and the PMO, the Prime Minister's office, does that. With sometimes without even the knowledge of members of Parliament for the area. They go in and do robocall efforts. They of course hire pollsters to go out and test the waters, and they may have way more detailed info than the member of Parliament, him or herself.
And so you can see how different this is compared to what Jean-François has investigated, because when he's looking at how things have behaved in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the technology to be able to communicate the same messaging was very, very limited compared to the way things are today, where everything is in the palm of your hand.
So that goes back, Jean-François, to what you're saying about the slow creep of new rules that were put in place that started to merge those two things. So people really started to be much more loyal to the powers that be rather than to their constituents in the first place, to the party, not the people.
In a sense, at the time of Confederation and a few decades that followed, MPs, like Alex says, were close to their population, to their riding. They didn't have public opinion polls, so they had you had a lieutenant for a province. The prime minister would go and ask, how are things going in Ontario, Quebec, or the Maritimes, wherever you were from, and you could basically get elected by knowing the names of 200 or 300 people in some cases, and as the size of the electorate grew, as the size of the government grew, it became more and more difficult to dispense patronage or to know these voters. So you rely more on the party, but the party would ask you in return to sort of support the platform that got you elected. Because before you could say, vote for me and I'll bring back patronage in the riding, and I'll defend our interests, and I'll break party line when it doesn't match with what I think is in the best interest of our riding. And you did see a lot of MPs do that. Not, it wasn't everyone, but there were quite a few mavericks, or loose fish, as Johnny McDonald would call them, right? So, but over time, these sort of, the modernization of the country, and the expansion of the electorate, the growth, economic growth, and all that, put a bigger premium on party platforms and to win elections. Patronage reform around World War I also limited the number of jobs that you can bring back in the riding. All of this made MPs more reliant on what the party brand meant, even at that level, right? Even at that point in time, I mean. So this sort of independence that you could break from party line and rely on your own personal prestige to get reelected. That's very. It's still possible today, but it was much more common around in the 19th century and in the first half of the 20th.
And today we're watching prime ministers appoint candidates in ridings despite what the voters and the local councils want. Was that even possible back then?
Well, there are always cases that are go both ways, but I think it was possible. It wasn't as organized as today, but there were conventions even in the 19th century where you would have to fight it off, and sometimes even physically, to get appointed as a candidate, especially in a riding that was not very competitive, and meaning that you won the sort of the candidacy. That meant you were probably going to become an MP. But in other cases, it didn't really matter which party you were from, you were affiliated with. Some MPs waited until they got into parliament to declare, I'm a liberal or I'm a conservative. Whoever was in power, that was because they were all men, that was my guy, right?
Right. So
that I can bring back in my writing, I can bring back the benefits of the government, so patronage and whatnot. And these sort of advantages slowly were centralized by party and the government, and therefore, like those free radicals kind of were a dying breed by the end of the 19th century.
I moved to Ottawa in the mid-'70s as a young reporter. I'll claim I was 12 at the time. But it was the discussion then that what we were witnessing under Pierre Elliott Trudeau was a consolidation of power in the PMO. That you had very, very powerful advisors, the Jim Coots, the Keith Davies of the world, and they had figured out that decision-making had to come away not only from the MPs, but a little bit from the cabinet table as well. Although he did have very open cabinet meetings, I'll give him that. But that sense of the PMO being the central body that operates, and that the information and the direction emanated from there rather than coming up from the ground. From both Alex and you, Jean, I want to just hear a little bit about that. Alex, why don't you just start on that one?
Well, there's no question that when you look at it, that there was an expansion of the Prime Minister's office under Pierre Trudeau, particularly 68 to 71 seems to really be a very large expansion. And the thing is, there's never really been a retrenchment, that it's just been a constant development. Really, the research that I do is about how it's really the communications that march as it's moving on that has increased this. So the more that the Prime Minister's office can centralize messaging, the more power it ends up getting. The more that we pay attention to leaders, the less we pay attention to regular candidates and members of parliament. So for me, I think one of the, a good way of thinking about this, about how things that were shocking at one point eventually become kind of regular, is if you think about all of the concern that occurred with Stephen Harper creating this 24/7 platform that involved putting out, they had a photo of the day at one point, and then it became of these videos. I think it was around 2010 when I looked at it, Harper put out 227 photos of the day in the entire year. So there were days there were no photos at all. And journalists were getting really upset because they had no control over who was putting out the photographs. There was the photographer who was there, the official photographer who was getting this backstage access. Now, photos and videos of the prime minister are constant all day long. And I'll just finish off by saying this. If you think about the power of the prime minister's office to do this, and it's also the other leaders' offices, what this does is this centralizes the message, because who is it that's getting these photographs all day long and these videos? First and foremost, it's the partisans, it's the MPs and their staff. So they know what the message of the day is all the time.
It's also a mechanism to circumvent any kind of journalistic assessment being imposed on that message. If the pictures are out and you're a local news station in Regina or Saskatoon or Yorkton in my part of the world here, those pictures, those videos are helpful because you don't have crews anywhere. So it was a way to get around the national media. Or in the case now, I think we see differently with Justin Trudeau, it's a way to manage it and harness that force of the national media.
Yeah, you're completely right. And I think we also, everything always has to be put into perspective. So, a lot of the era that JF was looking at, really in the early 1900s, you had the party press in the late 1800s.
Right.
And so, John A. Macdonald was concerned about something. He would try to find a way to arrange for a conservative to buy up an entire newspaper.
Right.
So it's not like these battles between the press are entirely new. But the real difference, I would argue, is the speed and also the consequences for going off message. If you are somebody who is affiliated with a political party and you publicly take a stand that is different than the leader, that's going to turn into drama. Your opponents are going to exploit it. They're going to try to stir division. They're going to say, well, which is it now? Even the prime minister or the leader's own members of the party do not agree with their position. Right. All of this ends up being turmoil. And one of the things that people told me when I was interviewing them, they often used these expressions. They said, you can't freelance. So that's a phrase that is very common. Don't freelance. Don't have your own kind of public thinking. And as well, they're always concerned about spotting daylight between what you say and what the leader says. How can you operate a democracy when you have those types of constraints?
I have so seen that movie, but that's another issue. We'll talk about that another time. So, okay, I'm going to like calling Jean-François JF. Do I get to do that too? Can I call you JF? That's great. So about that, when did you see any changes in voting patterns over time that relate to that?
Yeah, in fact, there is also a centralization of parliamentary procedure that occurs after World War II, especially in 1968, which you mentioned as the Pierre Trudeau majority government. What they did also was overhaul the procedures, standing orders of the House to establish permanent committees. So before bills were debated, usually on the whole floor of the House, so every MP had some opportunities to introduce amendments and whatnot. This was all moved to committees, and the supply procedure was modified as well. He created what we know as Opposition Day that didn't exist before.
Right.
This basically gave a little more power to party leader away from backbenchers. And then in the 1980s, this time still with Trudeau, this time you had another overhaul of the rules in 1982, which basically cut the length of admissible length of parliamentary speech you can make. So from 40 minutes now, you can only make a 20-minute speech. And we all know that's if the speaker is generous, right? But before you could basically talk an issue out for a long time if you organize a film. So it reduced the influence of backbencher that way. They also reduced the number of hours of sitting days, which was a great reform for parents, especially women who had to care of children and whatnot. So before they used to sit until midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. every week. This kind of non-business friendly schedule was wrecking. At least in Quebec, I spoke to some MPs in MLAs, as you call them in English. We say Assemblée Nationale in French. But they were telling me when they had these reforms installed, it was really because the women had such a hard time to juggle their personal life with their professional life. But anyway, reducing these hours also put a bigger premium on government business in Parliament as opposed to issues that could be debated by private members, right? Even though it had been a little bit more time fixed in the daily proceedings to debate these issues. It's still not as frequent, and it was if we compare it to earlier in time as it once was. So, but on more government business in the House means more control of the agenda by the government. And now, like with Andrew Scheer, when he was speaker, you basically had the issue of Michael Chum or whoever standing up. Can they be recognized to speak if they are not in the order decided by the party during the debates? And even on these questions now, it seems that party hand a list of who can speak to the speaker in the House of Commons. Even though it says in the rule that the speaker will recognize whoever stands first or catches his or her eyes.
Correct.
But in reality, we know that this is based on a list that the whips or the parliamentary leader hand out to the speaker. And to be on that list, Alex will tell you have to play nice with the leaders. So we went from a system where you could introduce an amendment on the budget, whatever, on the floor of the House, to moving stuff to committees, to basically taking away your right to speak as much as you could, to controlling what you're saying, and now to control when you can access. If you want to intervene during Standing Order 31 now, these 1 minute speech,
right?
There's a list controlled by the whips, and if you don't play the party game, you won't get that 1 minute to just talk about.
Well, this goes to this whole notion of very strictly run or whipped caucuses, as it were, because that is what's happened. That you cannot stand up and speak spontaneously. I mean, technically the right is there, but the speaker is unlikely to recognize you if you're not on the list, because that's all been negotiated behind closed doors with the party leaders or the whips, the ones that manage the activities in the House, and that's true on the Senate side as well. So there is that whole notion of this being the place where MPs or senators can stand and truly represent their regions is really a bit of a fraud these days. Alex, do you want to take that on?
Yeah, well, the first thing, I think a lot of MPs and others would say that this exists for a reason. I mean, you have to do this. If you don't do this, you're going to get shredded alive. So it's not like anybody's really to blame so much as they just feel that the system kind of conditions you to behave in this manner. And a lot of them will also point out that the real place to speak your mind is in caucus. Now, I would say that, in fact, it's usually the leaders and the leaders circle who says caucus is the place to speak up. Because as I mentioned, staff are there, so there's a lot of sort of a spiral of silence. A lot of people don't really feel comfortable speaking there. The real place now to speak up is actually in regional caucus. Because in regional caucus, you can speak with your colleagues and you don't really have as much fear, and there's more opportunity. There's fewer members there, so you can speak up. But of course, these are layers removed away from power. And so being able to speak your mind in public, the days of doing that, I would argue, are long gone, because if you do that, you really risk the possibility of your entire career just imploding.
And if you're making your concerns known or bitching or complaining in regional caucus, I mean, those are people that by and large are like-minded. They understand why you're raising issue X because they live there too.
Yeah. You're support, if anything.
Yeah, you're preaching to the converted. So what the two of you spend your academic lives doing this research. You get to watch the news every day as well and see what happens. What are you worried? Alex, I'll stay with you on this one. Are you worried about the fate and future of democracy, about how this functions, whether it's even a relevant body? I'll come back later and talk about some of the operational stuff, but just that big picture.
So ultimately, on balance, I have a lot of confidence that Canada's heading in the right direction. I mean, things like the Charter of Rights and Freedoms are ultimately making Canada a better place. But I think what is increasingly happening is Parliament is becoming perceived as irrelevant. And that's the problem. Once you're perceived as irrelevant, you effectively, your relevance does decline. And the real issue, I think, that people don't fully recognize is the implications of having members of the governing party acting as though they are part of the government. So when there's a cabinet and every minister has a parliamentary secretary, the parliamentary secretary is not part of the government. The parliamentary secretary is not part of cabinet. And yet the parliamentary secretary is always going to behave as though they're a quasi-cabinet minister. Then you have
and speaks for the minister.
Right,
yeah.
Right. So then you have all these backbenchers who want to become a parliamentary secretary, want to become a minister. They all are climbing up. They're all repeating the government's line. Essentially, what we end up having is a bunch of vote machines who are just spinning out what is being provided to them. That's the perception. So I think the challenge for Canadian democracy is the perceived irrelevance of Parliament. That, in effect, reduces its relevance.
Well, what we've seen here in the middle of COVID, and it troubles me greatly, which is we've decided that debate and discussion isn't that important if there's an emergency. So the more that politicians can claim there's an emergency, the less real debate there is. For example, in the Senate, we're not even functioning in a virtual manner yet. The House of Commons is. So when we gather for one day here or one day there, we're just expected to pass this legislation because people are in need without the proper scrutiny. Well, if you can do it in 15 minutes in the middle of COVID, then why do you need 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 days when there's no COVID? You should, and I don't think there's an appreciation that debate and that discussion is just not happening. It's just being denied at this point.
Right. So the ultimate responsibility here is on the legislators themselves. So if enough members of the House of Commons or enough senators all grouped together and said, we are putting up with this, we are going to stick it to the government to let them know that we matter, then the government would learn pretty fast that they can't take the parliament for granted. But as long as there's a majority of members of the legislature willing to go along with what the government says, then the government has every reason to say, well, why should we worry about Parliament? We know that ultimately they're just going to go along with us.
I want to talk about that very issue of majorities and minorities at this point, but I just want to go back to Jean-François for a moment, because if we're talking about COVID as a reason to undermine democratic debate or the ability to question the actions of government of the day, what did we do in other crises? What happened to voting in World War I and World War II and other situations? Did you see any blips in the system?
Well, closure was introduced in 1913, right on the eve of World War I, in a crisis situation without the consent of the opposition party.
Just explain what closure is, because it's still used today.
I am a parliamentary nerd. I apologize. So closure is, as the word entails, is a forced ending of debate, if you will, in Parliament. And so you close the issue. We're not talking about it anymore, and let's have a vote. Right. So it's really, it's like a gag, if you will. You're forcing the government's position on the opposition. It used to be you could talk out an issue all the way up to an election. Around 1890, that happened over the Manitoba school question, and it happened also over free trade before 1910. I think it was the can't remember, 11 election. But look at my book. Yeah, I don't remember what I wrote, but I know.
We'll check it out. Don't worry.
I have the precise reference in the book. But yeah, so it does. Crises can sort of hinder debate and discussion if there's some perceived urgency. We weren't quite yet in World War I, but if you read the transcript of the debate, I think Borden had some some valid reason to want to introduce closure, because he was in contact with the empire, and they were telling him, well, it's the World War I is going to happen soon, and we got to be prepared. We're going to have the money. And so perhaps it's a similar situation here, where the government knows some things and they're like, well, we need to get things done and it's not time. But nevertheless, just to get back to a point of members getting organized and seizing back the power, I think that the Senate gives us a good example of how this thing doesn't work. Because remember, the logic of the reform was to weaken the whole of party influence inside the Senate. And what do we have now in the Senate? Just as you will see in my book, I wrote a chapter on the Senate, and I predicted a long time ago, because I wrote this in 2000, right after Trudeau expelled all the senators from the Liberal Party.
The Liberal senators, yeah.
Yes, before 2015, right? I knew that based on just the theory of organization of legislature, that you need to have organized caucuses to get things done, right? So I think you can wrestle some influence back, but the parties, the history of, there's very few cases around the world of a situation where you see they had a high level of discipline and then it went to zero discipline. It's always moving in the more disciplined direction, right? I think, if at the base is our complaint that our MPs are not representing our interests by voting with the party all the time. So are we complaining because our MP is not of the same party as we prefer in our riding? Or is it the case that the MP is really like going against 100% of the riding or the province, and then voting, or the senator voting against the interest? So, and that's why I've written elsewhere, I don't really like to to make normative claims or to say this is how Canada should be. I study and I try to diagnose the problem, but I came to the conclusion that if we rely so much on party, perhaps people should be allowed to vote for parties and not vote for MPs that represent geographies, right? Because it's kind of creating this expectation that this MP is going to be representing my riding. But once they get to Parliament, they basically vote the party. So why not?
Exactly.
I thought perhaps having a mixed electoral system where you could vote for a party list, at least you would get that representation. That to me seemed like a more logical way, because we rely so much on program now, party program. We expect so much from the parties, yet we're kind of putting MPs in a tough situation where we expect them to be independent. But the system now doesn't. It's not like 1900 where, and even in a glorious revolution, where the MPs would go on their horse and ride to Westminster and vote for the county or the sheriff or whatever. Things have evolved with our institution. They have some advantages. They're old and stable. The Westminster system is a very, very powerful and positive influence for stable democracies.
The Senate was supposed to be, and is to some degree, that chamber of sober second thought, the last stage of review of legislation that comes from a house that functions in a very highly partisan manner. And we're there to represent the regions. However, the other structure, the structure of the House of Commons, was superimposed on the Senate because the Prime Minister of the day got to appoint the senators. So they, by and large, became partisans. And then we saw that process in the House of Commons replicated in the Senate, that there was a conservative whip and a government whip, and you can call them whatever you want, the independent senators group or whatever. But people tend to be beholden to the person that put them there. Alex, do you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that the whole idea that the appointment power of the Prime Minister is significant. And so it's not even just appointing people to the Senate, it's the possibility, the lure of cabinet, the possibility of becoming a parliamentary secretary. I think one thing to keep in mind is there's all sorts of other perks behind the scenes as well that we never see. So I mean, maybe if you're paying a lot of attention, you'll notice who becomes the chair of a committee. But some of the deeper things that a lot of people talk about is they want to go on parliamentary trips. And if you don't toe the party line guess what? You're not going to be able to go on this trip. You really wanted to go to this all expensive junket to somewhere in the world, and it's gone. But then it can also just be small things. It can be that you, for whatever reason, really want or need to get back to your hometown, and you're in Ottawa, and you
Right.
want to get a flight late on a Thursday instead of sticking around on a Friday. And the whip's office can say, sorry, we need you here on Friday. You're not going anywhere. You need to learn.
Yep. You have to show up. You're doing
Exactly.
house duty. Yeah.
These are all these little things. And I think one thing here is worth commenting on, and I mentioned this in the book. There was something some people have heard of called the Stanford prison experiment. It was a really famous experiment, involved putting all these pretend prisoners together. Withholding bathroom breaks can be really, really powerful. When you extrapolate that to being somebody who is in a position of power, and you say to somebody, look, you can't go home early on a Thursday, you are exerting an incredible amount of power over somebody's life. Because behind the scenes, they're trying to navigate things with their spouse and their family members.
Right.
You're throwing them into disarray, and you're also telling them, look, you're not a free agent. You are not an independent thinker here. You are part of the party first and foremost, as opposed to somebody who was just elected to do whatever they want.
And to me, that contradiction is even larger in the Senate. This exact same stuff applies in terms of committee chairs and travel, and can you leave on Thursday to get home because there's only a flight at night, like the whole 9 yards. It's all the same. But we are supposed to be the place where that doesn't occur. And it brings me back to majority governments, because I think people sometimes aren't aware. We think of Donald Trump or the US president being the most powerful person in the world, but actually he's got a fair number of checks and balances on him. A majority government, a majority prime minister in this country is all powerful, or even a minority prime minister who has a friend in a smaller party who's willing to support them and cut a deal and make sure that they don't have to go to an election. Very few checks and balances, and the Senate is supposed to be the other place. So it's the last place that should be run in the same way that the House of Commons is. I expect elected people to be more loyal to the parties that brung them to the dance. I expect less of that in the Senate.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that raises the question about whether or not senators ought to be elected, which is really a theoretical discussion anyway. And even then, what electoral system would you use? And would they only end up aligning with parties?
Exactly.
I mean, there's all these things. I think really the best thing we can hope for is that we just have to put a lot of faith and trust in senators to engage in a level of scrutiny that we are not necessarily going to see in the House of Commons. I mean, if we know that people in the House of Commons are under all sorts of pressure to toe the party line, parliamentary committees, particularly if there's a majority government, is going to be controlled by the government. Hopefully the Senate can be that place of sober second thought that can also look at the long game, not just worried about, there's going to be an election next month or something.
Right. And that should be it, but unfortunately. What did you see, Jean-François, in terms of voting and voting behavior, minorities, majorities? Was there any change there? Did you see in your long view of history there that people behaved any differently?
There's definitely like a pattern of tighter party discipline when under minority government, because you cannot afford to sort of lose. If you're the government, you cannot afford to lose a vote or two when it comes down to a government survival. One thing you can notice is that the larger the caucus, the win a majority government is. Say Mulroney in 1984.
Right.
And perhaps Alex can talk a bit about this because he's interviewed Brian Mulroney, but it's a little harder to hold the caucus together because you have, in this case, you have Western interests, Quebec interests together. And so that's one thing I noticed. I also looked at how parties vote together, who supports whom during minority government. Not the most recent one, but the three we had in 2000s. in the 2000s. And what I found is that, I mean, it's not always what you expect. That you expect the NDP is going to vote with the Liberals under Martin. Sometimes you or the Conservative are going to get the Liberal support. Sometimes you have the NDP voting with the Conservative when Harper was in a minority government. And the only explanation I found was that they were broke. The party had no money. They weren't popular. So they were telling their MPs, you know what? And that's what happened with
we can't afford an election. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And the latest Tron speech, the Quebec MP did not vote with the NDP to support the Liberal on the amendment about proposed by the Bloc Québécois on funding for COVID, if I recall.
Right.
And the only reason I can think of is we can afford with the NDP, right? We're supporting the government, but we can afford some dissension in order to protect our only representative in Quebec, or else he'll be attacked by the Bloc by saying, look, he's voting against the interest of the province and whatnot. But if you're a Liberal and from Quebec, you can't, once it's a minority government, you can be told, you can ask the whip, can I go to the bathroom during the vote and come back when the vote is over, or fly home or whatever, or even, vote against my own party. Some people do, some MPs still do it, but it's really a handful of MPs, and it's very rare.
No, that's exactly the only option you're left, right? Which is you accidentally on purpose leave the room when the vote occurs. So, and it's, you may even be punished for that in that case. There's another issue, and you've just mentioned it, Jean-François, because it's always there, the competing interests. And sometimes you have, and I'm thinking back to the NEP debate, the National Energy Plan, certainly during the Constitution. Some issues today on energy, but not always. You see Quebec nationalists and Western
regionalist.
Yeah, regionalists. That's a good word to put it. Sometimes forming common cause and against the party. Is there a history of that you've seen in the voting in the numbers?
Yeah, the first rebellion that occurred about related to the imposition of party discipline in Parliament is a Western movement, a Western grown movement, the progressive movement around 1900, beginning of the 20th century, and the creation of the Progressive Party, which is more like it occurred first in the province and then it was transferred to the federal parliament. But Thomas Querwar, which was the first leader, used to be a Liberal. He sat with the Conservative. He moved around quite a bit, but one of the main reason the platform of the party was to say, look, we're not going to let the MPs succumb to party discipline, to money interest, and what they call partyism at the time. We're going to let them vote their district, vote their conscience. We're going to have recall election. All of this was, you listen to Preston Manning in 1994, and you hear the same sort of issues popping up about we want our MPs to represent the interest of our district. We want to have some recall. But this sort of first movement against party discipline was already in play in the 1920s, and that's the first organized third party we had in Parliament. So one of the arguments I make in this book is you can have a lot of party discipline, and it can work if there's only a left and right division. You'll have two parties, but throw in Western interests, throw in Quebec nationalists, the party system is going to explode unless you let MPs pretty much break party line every once in a while. And Bloc, the Bloc Québécois in 1993, after the disappearance, l'échec, I'm looking for the word in English, the failure of the Meech-Lake Accord, that really mobilized Quebec nationalists inside the Liberal Party and inside the Conservative Party, and they went ahead and from Parliament created a new party, the Bloc Québécois. which is still around today.
And
So
Mulroney had brought a lot of those people in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's a danger to have these cross-cutting, opposing coalition inside the same party. It can work for a little bit, but if you impose discipline, if you try to get your MP to all go in the same direction, it might backfire, and you'll be left with a broken party system as it happened in the 1920s and in the 1990s.
Alex, I'm dying to hear you on this. Jump in.
Well, I mean, I can't let any comment about Mulroney pass up without remarking on what I found about him. And part of it was what he had told me, but also some other members, because whenever you do research, you need to double check, of course. It was amazing. Right. Like, I'd always wondered, why was Mulroney so unpopular nationally at one point, and yet still able to hold on to his caucus? I mean, it's a kind of a puzzle, because nowadays, even Andrew Scheer gets run out of town, and yet the Conservatives got more votes than the Liberals did in the election.
Exactly.
Brian Mulroney is able to hold everybody together, and a lot of it had to do with, and a lot of people have heard this, but I'd never seen it written down anywhere the way I have. It was phoning people on their birthdays. It was that one of the things I found most interesting, Pat Carney mentions it in her book. She says that at one point her son graduated from high school, and her son got a letter from the prime minister saying, "Congratulations for graduating from high school." And it's like, how does he even know this? Handwritten. I mean, it was the amount of effort that he put in. And he was explaining to me when we spoke that this is really, really important, because if you can't keep your caucus together as a prime minister, you're not going anywhere. And the reason why I want to bring this up is because
100% true.
Contrast in a way to Justin Trudeau as prime minister, because I was also really struck at how Justin Trudeau is a very different prime minister than every other prime minister we've had. He's the only prime minister who has grown up as a celebrity from birth, who has constantly had media attention, who has embodied the Liberal Party, and who people have sought him out. Even Pierre Trudeau had to cultivate the support of the Liberal Party to him.
Right.
And so as a result, I think what's happened with Justin Trudeau is all of these staff kind of act as layers the way you would around a celebrity, as gatekeeper, and are dealing with things on his behalf. And this ends up alienating a lot of Liberal MPs who feel like they never get any time with Justin Trudeau. And it was only with the SNC-Lavalin crisis that all of a sudden Trudeau started spending time with people, reaching out to them, having lunch with them, all the kinds of things that Trudeau, his father, and others did on a regular basis.
Yeah. And certainly Brian Mulroney.
Definitely, yes.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really, really important point, because, with Justin Trudeau, what you see is it's all about him. Now, it was the case with his father too, but he had people do that on his behalf. Prime ministers can't do all the research themselves, but I think you're right. I think until his back was against the wall, he didn't understand how important that was. And Mulroney was superb at it, absolutely superb. He understood that was the glue, and without the glue, then you get those little breaks in caucus. You get somebody up and leaving the room when there's a vote. You get them grumbling when they're back home in the riding, and then that's when the media steps in and does that. Alex or Jean-François, any thoughts on that whole issue about the question of style, not just substance, of the leadership on this question, how it affects things?
The argument I make in the book is more institutional, in the sense that I look at like I mentioned before, the structure of the party system,
right,
in Parliament. So although I don't doubt that individual played an important role, like the personality of Trudeau, father or son, or Wilfrid Laurier, and this decision that these people made in office, they had a role to play. What really I found is that the institution are pretty darn good at explaining the variation we see in the voting records, and that's excluding sort of personality quirks. I'm not denying that they have an effect, but it's difficult to sort of try to measure
to
that.
get it from the voting records.
Looking at the voting records, you're better off saying, well, what was this vote about? Was it about a divorce? And was that MP a Catholic? Then you voted against that when they had divorce vote in the Senate and in the House.
Yeah, exactly. Are either one of you, and I'll just start with Alex on this. I mean, you studied this, you look at it. Does it make you think about becoming involved in politics, or does it make you run screaming, your hair on fire, the other direction?
It's a good question. I think really the best way for me to answer that is that the last chapter in this book outlines a number of tips that people have conveyed to me about how you can be a strong parliamentarian. So it's not something that would be for me, but for anybody who is thinking about potentially becoming a elected official, the final chapter in particular, instead of providing, I'm kind of like JF, I don't provide all these suggestions about how to reform things. Because a lot of the time nothing comes of it. So instead what I've done is I've itemized, here's what you can do to be a strong parliamentarian. And one of the number one things that people told me is you really need to build a coalition and support within the party. It's a lot of work to affect change. You don't just suddenly say, I think this. You phone people, you talk to them, you go to their office, you consult with them, you build a case. Maybe you use the media a little bit, but it's a lot of work, and you can affect change provided that the leader has a good sense that a lot of members of caucus feel the same way. As if a lot of members of caucus disagree with you, the leader's not going to side with you.
It's I think that's very insightful, because I think the difference between how the external world sees members of parliament, that they run off to Ottawa and they go to all these events and get free food, and then they jump on planes and come home, and the life is very, very difficult. It's hard work. Most people are separated from their families and their communities, whether it's their geographic community or their communities of faith or whatever it may be. It can be a lonely and a difficult life. And I think that people need to appreciate that side, despite the fact that they might be angered that that person is not representing them in the same way. I think most people went with the right intentions. Jean-François, I'm just going to go to you. Is it the same as Alex, that you look at this in an analytical way, but you have no interest in stepping over the line and becoming a player?
No, I think, like you said, this is a very, very difficult job to be a politician. And being a university professor is a very, very interesting job for me. And I don't think I worked as hard, like in terms of numbers of hours working and the energy that, the conviction that is necessary to do all this work. I really think it's something amazing that politicians are doing. So the job really scares me, and I have no interest in running for office. I hope you're not recruiting, but
no, I'm certainly not.
Okay, but
well, you might want to come to the Senate, because we do have a little bit more independence there.
No, I'm like, just to maybe a word about the Senate. I mean, in my book, you'll see that I'm quite critical of the reform, in the sense that I think that it's really difficult to reform without having a constitutional amendment the chamber. So
100% agree with you. Yeah.
It's very difficult to reform. So what do? I think the positive of this reform is that it's increased diversity of representation of groups that are not traditionally being represented in the Senate, in the House of Commons as well. So now we have that in the Senate, so that's good. And also, like the whole party bagman being promoted for loyal services. My great uncle Theodore Godbout got a cushy Senate job after being Prime Minister of Quebec, because he voted for conscription during World War II, and he, I don't know if it was part of the deal, but that used to be when you didn't have a nice retirement fund plan, you could maybe get a seat in the Senate as a reward for party services. This is gone. This is, the commission, the way we're selecting senator, this is this as I take as is a positive. But the more negative aspects of it, we've talked before, and you're in this chamber, so you know, and you said, well, it's basically operating, and although there's not supposed to be party effect and party discipline and whips and government and opposition. There is an André Pratt, which I spoke to Senator Pratt a few times when he was in the Senate. He told me the conservative are making it so, like he was blaming because he's a politician, right? So it wasn't his fault. He was saying the conservative are making people look bad. They're forcing us to vote on issues that we basically don't necessarily want to have a debate about, but that they're playing a political game and we want to be independent. But that's the problem. Is sort of is, and this is what I argue in my book, is when you have a pie and you want to divide it, and you have 100 independent senators, the first 51 who organize together are going to get 100% of the pie.
That's exactly right.
So I think the way forward is to limit the influence, the power of the Senate more as a consultative body by changing the rule. Blocking legislation is not. Let's face it. Senators are appointed. They may have good intention. I'm sure they. I'm not criticizing your work, but
no. I don't.
You still don't have a mandate, and popularly elected mandate. You're not going to get one until we change the Constitution, which is not something that's going to happen.
But then, who is the check and balance on a majority government?
You can have the Salisbury Convention. You can sort of voluntarily limit how long you can block. I'm sorry switching language here, but you can block a bill for let's say a few months, let's say a term, like a session. Although our session now can last 4 years, but let's just say you can, with your own rule, you can decide we're going to be discussing, debating, amending. But when it goes, like with the marijuana bill, the cannabis bill, when it goes back, the amendments are rejected. We're just going to abide by the will of the House, which is just where the sovereignty lies. But you can still have a positive input, and let's get that in writing and organize the rules. But obviously, you need the approval of the Conservative, which is an organized caucus that supports the opposition. So it's not going to be easy.
And it works the flip way when the governments are flipped, right?
Yes, correct. Yeah, that's exactly it.
And the government caucus inside Senate is the same. I don't know. It's puzzling. Alex, I'll give you one final last word on this.
I think the main thing is that for most Canadians, it would be what really matters to them. And I'm not so sure that a lot of them really get all that upset about what happens in Ottawa, what happens on Parliament Hill, until they have a reason to do so. So I think that they don't necessarily pay attention to the daily to and fro, but if they feel that the government is trampling on democracy, that they will respond to that they get very upset at that. I mean, the biggest example of that would be the pipeline debate, 1957, and people just getting so frustrated with the arrogance of the government of the day. So I think that a government always has to be very careful. And we saw that a little bit with MP Scott Reid taking a stand early on about how the government was approaching trying to get all these spending powers for, over a year. You need people like that to be able to just stand up and say, wait a second, what's going on here? Like, we have to respect that Parliament exists for a reason.
I think it's a really an excellent point, and I think it is incumbent on all of us to, whether an elected member of Parliament or an appointed member of the Senate, to take our responsibility seriously. We've got to go in there and do our job. I'm there to represent my region and the interests that they care about, and I'm there to be a check and balance on government. And if I just put my hand up because if I'm the monkey and the grinder tells me, then I'm not worthy of the job. And I think you've hit on a point that the public expects us to do this. This great conversation today. Thank you so much. Alex Marland's book, Whipped: Party Discipline in Canada, and Jean-François Godbout, Godbout, am I getting that close?
Yes.
Lost on Division, Party Unity in the Canadian Parliament. You guys are really doing good work, and I'll bring you together again for sure. I'll just leave us all with this thought. Some wise person said this: the first act of all persuasion is clarity of purpose. And I think our two guests today really helped us focus in on what our purpose should be, those of us who serve through the House of Commons or the Senate of Canada. Thanks again.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.